Remind folks, in case you haven't already renewed your annual membership, we go on a calendar year, so if you haven't already renewed, please do that. Easiest way to do that is to go to our website, which is demcenturyclub.org. demcenturyclub.org. It's real easy to do. Let's see, where are my e-board members? Can you raise your hands? Okay. These are all the volunteers who help keep the club running, so please give them a round of applause. Also, I want to remind the e-board members that our next meeting will be next Wednesday by Zoom at noon. And let's see, do we have a fairly small group today, so do we have any elected officials or candidates who would like to introduce themselves and say hello? Okay, and of course, no meeting is complete without our county party chair, Bill James. And I will now move on to introduce the speaker, who's the one you actually came to hear. So Brent Turner is a graduate of Lincoln Law School in San Francisco and has a degree granted by the University of San Diego in International Legal Studies from Oxford, England. He's also a community activist whose efforts have included volunteer work for the homeless, children's health and education, civil rights, and environmental issues. Brent was instrumental in the creation of the, gotta take a deep breath here, San Francisco County Voting Systems Task Force, and has been a director of communications for Open Voting Consortium. Brent has been recognized as a groundbreaking activist for sustainability and dedicates himself to local, state, and federal issues. Brent's going to tell us all about open source or paper ballot voting systems today. Please give a warm welcome to Brent Turner.
Thanks.
Well, thank Peter and Craig and the club for having me out. I'm always surprised when people are interested to hear more about election system and all the issues surrounding it in these crazy days. So I'll go through my spiel and try to give you a good overview of what I've seen in the last 20 years as a pro bono advocate for solution to some of the problems that plague the space, and then open it up for question and answer, because I really think that that's the best way to move the conversation along, so that when you have questions, just please feel free to ask me either along the way, or I will open up the floor and try to engage if I can. My particular role in this, and I was mentioning this to some folks yesterday in conversation, is I became an advocate in 2000. We were looking at the Bush v. Gore situation, and I think all of us were curious what was going on exactly with our election. And that, of course, was more surrounding the paper ballot and the management of the paper ballot. We remember the Brooks Brothers riots and all the shenanigans going on. 2004, we saw the insertion of the electronic systems. And of course, those folks that were familiar with software raised questions at that time. I just happened to, I guess, maybe good or bad luck or skill, be at a conference where I saw a group, and I like to make it worse than it actually was sounding, but it looked like their sign was pencil or crayon, and everybody else had fancy booths, and they were called Open Voting Consortium. So that's an interesting place to start the story, because a fellow by the name of Alan Deckard that was the founder, one of the founders of Open Voting Consortium, I was intrigued by his solution to the crisis, in that you would have very manageable electronic systems that would embrace the paper ballot, and the paper ballot would not be hand marked, which leads to an error rate and some other things when people draw on them or fail to do it properly. For maximum precision, the idea is to have basically what we have now in San Mateo County, which is a process where the voter pushes the button and the ballot comes out perfectly printed. and then that ballot is scanned through a tabulator system. Well, the only problem with what we're doing now in the United States, if you want to refer to the San Mateo system, is they have a good design, which they actually, I think, for lack of a better term, gifted themselves from Alan Decker's design of a proper system. But their system is using proprietary vendor sold and controlled software code. So the problem with proprietary code is you don't have enough eyeballs on the process to assure that the code is what it's supposed to be. And the benefit to what we call open source software code or public code is that you can have the complete community of developers and smarty pants folks looking at the code and making sure that there is no problems within the code. And if there are problems, it can be addressed. This creates a response time that's much different than in the current environment where you have veritably 3 or 4 companies controlling the marketplace, and their guys in their back rooms are the ones looking at the code. So currently, to be blunt, because this is a good crowd to be blunt with and time is short, it's easy to go along and not pay attention to this part of it, the software code, but really the public should be aware that we can do better and there is solution. Currently, the good news is there, and I think we all need some, is that currently there are solutions available through, particularly there's a nonprofit vendor group called Voting Works that has created what we call a general public license, open source paper ballot voting system. So if you take away anything from this get together, those are the words to remember: general public license, open source, paper ballot voting system. Because if you have that, you are the dynamics change of the system. Bill?
Are you gonna say what that means? What is it? Does the software take those that prints a ballot and that's what they count?
Well, yeah, let me give a little explanation on point. The general, in order for the software to be utilized, it should be, really must be licensed. Currently, the licenses are, controlled by the corporations that I mentioned, but with a general public license open source software, you have the high ground of open source. And I won't get into the detail, but the better brains agree that the general public license is the high ground for open source software. So basically, at that point where you have that type of software and a paper ballot system, yes, as Bill mentioned, the voter experience is you're going to the poll site, you're pressing Jimmy Carter, a ballot comes out that says Jimmy Carter on it, and you look at it and make sure that that's what you voted. And there are other ways to shore up, making sure that the voter is fully aware of the ballot after it's been printed, because some folks will throw marbles under the equation and say, well, what if the voter doesn't look at the ballot? Well, that could happen, but if you shore it up through outside regulation and assistance and direction from the voting officials, we can pretty much make sure that the high percentage of voters are checking their vote, and then it goes into the counting part, which is the tabulation. Ideally, the votes would be counted at the precinct level previous to transportation, because once you start transporting them around without securing a good tight batch count, you're in peril. That being said, counties prefer central tabulation. So, we can't get everything we want in this space, but if we did listen to the security experts, we could tighten the systems up even more dramatically. But we understand that we can't get everything we want, but what we do think we can get is at least proper software, not software that is private and corporate controlled, but software that lives in the general public space and can be viewed by the world of programmers for appropriateness. That being said, people may say, well, gee, if everybody can look at it, doesn't that give a head start to the bad guys? Because now you're calling this open source. Does that mean that the bad guys get a head start and maybe that makes it easier to manipulate rather than the goal, which is obviously to secure the systems? Well, the reality is in the world of open source technology, you have an advantage by having the open source. And this we rely on, and at that point of the conversation, we refer people to the Department of Defense and the Air Force and others, NASA, that utilize open source software for mission critical operations. So we are in keeping in this election system security community with some folks that carry a pretty big stick of authority. And we refer people at that point to their findings if somebody wants to argue about what is actually a more secure way to go. So that's sort of a foundational starting point to this conversation. I made a few notes. Normally I don't refer to notes when I speak, but I wanted to today just so I didn't leave anything out. And I wanted to start with a quote to get some interaction, but this quote was made by a person. Let's see if you can guess who it is. It says, an unrepresentative Senate, an anti-democratic electoral college, a gerrymandered House and state legislatures, and a stolen, illegitimate Supreme Court. The ideal of every person having an equal say or a one person, one vote is far from a reality in the United States. Who do you think? Is that maybe Bobby Seale? No, Eric Holder.
Yeah.
Just a few days ago said that, and David Gergen, that flaming radical, David Gergen said, regarding our democracy, we cannot continue on the path we are on. It's unsustainable. So these are some smart folks. We believe this is a keystone of this issue. If we can secure the vote count and make sure at least that the people's will is being respected, and we don't have some corporate intermeddler or somebody else that has a better idea of what they think the public deserves. If we can get people out to vote, and of course there's 1,000 issues surrounding that, but at least once they vote, we can count their vote properly and make sure that's secure. We think we're ahead of the game, and since it's just amongst us, I think maybe this is a nonpartisan issue, obviously. But anyway, I think there may be more of us than there are of them. Okay. I got away from the microphones for that. That was cool.
This is a partisan group, so you're okay.
Yeah, no, I know, but we're live. Okay.
We're slightly
All right, we're live. We're live. Okay. Let's see here. An overview. An overview here. 3 companies control the national market. I don't believe any of them could qualify for a national security clearance, by the way. So that's interesting, and nor would we want them to. There's been conversation about having them have a national security clearance. I think I think if you looked into their backgrounds, that's probably a bad idea. Interestingly, Dominion, of course, who was the great evil in 2016 with the Democratic Party when Hillary lost, then of course when Biden won, all of a sudden it looked like Dominion was back on a good side. I don't think we want to be reliant upon whether they're on the good or the bad. We just want a proper vote count, and what they're selling is not really appropriate when there's better coming available, and we'll talk about coming available. Because of that technology I mentioned to you, the government is very incapable of oversight of the current systems. When you have the proprietary code in there, even though you have what's called the certification process of the systems. So people are looking at them before they go into the field and are deployed. That being said, it's a cursory inspection, and what they're called ITLs, independent testing labs. They're not really up to snuff either in this grand equation. So we want to take a hard look at them. The father of the certification process, a fellow by the name of Lloyd Saltman, told me bluntly that Alan Deckert, who I mentioned to you previous as the father of the open source work, that he told me, your buddy Alan's got the right idea. He said he never anticipated the vendors being as dark-hearted as they turned out to be. So the fact that there is this little problem of transparency with the current proprietary code, that allows the current vendors to play shell games, basically, with the code. I don't know if you remember, but at one point, former Secretary of State Deborah Bowen fined, I believe it was ES&S, I think a few $100,000 or $1 million for having the wrong code in what they call escrow. Now, as a real estate broker, I will tell you that escrow is a good word in real estate. It's not really a good word in election system security. And by the way, the fact that I am not really a techie, but actually a real estate broker, will tell you that the public, if they spend enough time, they can understand this issue, and we can clean this stuff up. This is layperson speak that I'm not techie. So we rely on some people that really are and know what they're talking about. And luckily, when you get enough of them in the open source environment, it's a worldwide community. They vet themselves and the cream rises, and you get that good think tank of people that really is the point of difference between the open source approach and having a few guys at a corporation try to outsmart each other and be smart as a unit. The numbers of the worldwide community really is what drives this think tank approach. The current vendors, I mentioned there were 3. On top of it, I mentioned their backgrounds aren't so hot. They tend to price gouge. So they're running our counties out of money for these systems because the systems are overpriced, because they know there's nowhere to go for these counties. So we're relegated to using what's available. Oftentimes it comes down to a sole source. For San Francisco, for instance, because of ranked choice voting, there's only one company that can really perform the service. So you're locked into them. And I mentioned to you at the beginning, now luckily we have the luxury of this nonprofit coming forward that is able to assist with these open source systems. Previous to this company, Voting Works, coming forward, we were trying to partner the open source community advocates. We're trying to partner with the government and tell them, hey, throw your money toward creating your own open source voting system, and you'll own the system, and you'll get out of this trap of having to buy from these vendors selling you the crappy stuff. Well, they agreed it was a good idea, but in the end, they really couldn't put it all together. It's a lot for government. New Hampshire did it, interestingly. We hoped California was going to do it, but New Hampshire ended up doing it. A great Secretary of State there by the name of Bill Gardner put forward a system that was created by a professor from the University of Florida, Dr. Juan Gilbert. And it met all the disability requisites, which are very important in this work. Basically, stop one along the road is making sure the disability community is facilitated, because if they're not happy, nobody's happy. So these systems became compliant with the disability community direction, and New Hampshire utilized them. Unfortunately not for the tabulation piece, but for the rest of the voter experience. It was done on open source, and it worked quite well. Recently, and I don't know if anybody can guess, the state that is taking the lead now for technology for elections, and has far surpassed California, making us look rather foolish. But I know you can probably all guess who it is, Mississippi. Mississippi now has leaped forward because they didn't have a voting system vendor that they liked. So I think the timing was right, and they were probably out of money like everybody else and opted for the Voting Works system. So if you look on the Voting Works website, they put up a video called How We Vote Here. And I thought it was pretty compelling, and it talked about this county in Mississippi using this simple system, and the officials saying, well, it's so much better than what we had and so much less expensive. And it looked like a dream come true. So I said, I can't just believe what I see on YouTube. I have to call this lady. So her name is on there. I encourage you to call her. And she answers the phone and says, yeah. And I said, you know, is that real? Did that really work? She said, oh, it's great. She said, everybody should do it. I recommend it highly. And, you know, we had a great experience. So that's the Mississippi story, which is, I keep using this when I'm speaking to our current Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, to say to her staff, you know, Mississippi is ahead of us. Does that seem appropriate, you know, coming out of Silicon Valley? No, not really. So speaking of Silicon, okay, here's the bad news. There is some people that would rather preserve the status quo and think that it's pretty good the way it is right now. So first step, I guess, is we have to admit we're in a crisis. And I think folks like, and I think it was actually on a call with this group, the 21st Century Group, Eric Swalwell said, yes, I asked him the question, should this be part of going open source with the election system? Should that be part of Biden's infrastructure bill? And he said, yes, it should. So recently, Christine Pelosi and Carolyn Fowler, who Carolyn is the head of the Women's Caucus, we all know Christine, Nancy's daughter, said, came out with an op-ed in Cal Matters saying, this is the way we have to go toward open source. We have to get out of this trap, and this is what we should do. The Little Hoover Commission, which is the technology advisor to Governor Newsom, was very blunt, saying, do this now. Whatever else you're doing, do this now. We still can't quite get there, and here's why. There's entrenched interests, obviously. The current vendors have the relationships with politicians as well as with election officials. So we have to be strategic and pester in appropriate timing when the other contracts are coming up and try to, you know, do that. That's up to this open source vendor that I mentioned. But there's also Microsoft in general doesn't like open source because they think of it as cutting into market share. And so we've had conversations with them regarding the national security and saying, you know, you should really not lobby on that. Let the open source community take over these election systems and make your money somewhere else or participate somehow, but don't block something that's better for the national security. And I've had the good pleasure of the friendship of the former director of the CIA, Jim Woolsey, who came to bat for us on this issue and made statement. And actually we were in a documentary together called The Real Activist. If you want to see a fun documentary that's on Amazon that portrays a day in the life of an activist on the subject. But Jim Woolsey was great in saying, hey, Putin is taking shots at our technology and our infrastructure. Let's move forward with what the DoD does in election system security, and we'll upgrade it. Well, we still haven't got there. At one point, Los Angeles County was given $300 million to do this. And this was a few years back at the urging of Alan Deckard, again, who I mentioned. Los Angeles moved toward doing this work ostensibly. Well, Deborah Bowen, if you remember, she started not feeling perfectly during her term. And so she sort of dropped away. The end result was the 300 million got evaporated, and they still don't have an open source software system. Although uniquely and unusually, I'll share with you folks, speaking bluntly, at the time, they announced that system after they spent the 300 million as an open source paper ballot voting system. And unfortunately, it was our duty to say that it doesn't qualify. It's not up to standard. And then that just went back to being a status quo system. San Francisco now has been pushing. Tom Amiano, if you remember Tom, was a big champion. And I may forget some people, but Scott Wiener has been the champion. Raphael Mendelman has been a champion for this. And currently Shimon Walton, president of the board, is championing this, interfacing with the Secretary of State's office. We tried to get a pilot pushed forward, and the secretary and her office, they just didn't get up to what I consider speed fast enough. So the pilot is pushed back, but we may get certification, which I mentioned to you previous, in California by 2023, 2024. Obviously, it would be great to have these systems in the swing states, maybe if they were following California's lead or on their own volition, getting this into the swing states as soon as possible. We don't have them in 22. And so hopefully it's just by sheer turnout, things go okay. And hopefully because we see the problem, whichever way it goes, when you have systems that don't inspire public confidence, the loser doesn't believe that they lost. And so it is more crucial by the minute that we have these systems where you can show people to a better extent, maybe not the extent they're ever going to believe, because certain people might never believe whatever you show them, but certainly to a larger, higher extent that, hey, bucko, here's the system, it's all transparent. You can see for your own eyes, and if you can't look at code, you know somebody that can, and the systems are working as presented. There's no monkey business that is visible to any member of the public or any other expert we can find. And so that's the idea, is to bring forward the better security, and it's doable. So there is hope, but I don't think there is a space with more disinformation on issue. Some people think that we should get rid of all the technology and hand count paper ballots, which isn't such a bad idea. It has its own security issues attached, but the reality is I don't think it's ever going to happen. And I think it's far-fetched to think that technology is going to retreat. That being said, I have become a major irritant to the group of activists called the hand counters, and they say, get rid of technology altogether and get rid of Turner, because what he's advocating is computers, which we don't want, but our position remains. We're using computers, let's clean them up and fortify them to the best extent possible. Okay, I think we're almost getting to question and answer. I went through, one thing I didn't mention to you was audits. And of course, that's another important part of the equation. You have the open source software, you have the paper ballots, and then even though that should give you a very tight first count, which is the crucial count in the event, but you should have a robust audit. So we saw in Georgia, for instance, they reverted to a hand count, a full hand count, which is great. So, you know, anytime you have a chance to count all the ballots by hand, you may get a different count every time because of human error. But if you're somewhere around that first count, and you'll get close enough, hopefully, to reconcile. And that is the idea, hopefully, to be spot on. And there are many experts that get red in the face and say, it should be perfect every time. It has to be perfect. The fact is, elections, they have a little natural thing. I think sometimes if you get within a few votes and you've got a huge election, you did pretty well. Speaking of doing pretty well, Shannon Boucher in Santa Clara, I think she's smart on this. It hasn't been the time for her. I don't think she wanted to build the system like we were suggesting previous, but now that there's somebody willing to really gift a system, work with a system that has one, I think we may see Santa Clara and hopefully San Mateo County, my home county, moving toward this as well. Although there has been some candidly deficiencies in both counties, in my opinion, because of course we're pushing the sooner the better to clean this up, and they're moving at the pace of government, which can be excruciatingly slow, as I'm sure all of you know. Okay, I think that's it. Let me just name some heroes we have within the party, and even though it's nonpartisan, Alan Deckard, I mentioned to you, Jim Woolsey, I mentioned Dr. Juan Gilbert, the head of the technology caucus for the Democratic Party, Brigitte Unley, has been stalwart on all this work. I mentioned Christine Pelosi, Shaman Walton, David Chu has been, and he is now a assembly member, but now the city attorney for San Francisco. He's undaunted in this stuff and really standing up strong. Basically, we're hoping that the Secretary of State, Dr. Weber, understands it would be a good time to move forward quickly and to defer to some of these open source technologists that really are the better thought leaders in this space, in this moment. So that's it. Before I make a final comment, I wanted to open it up to, I hope you have some questions for me. I know Greg at least has got one, but please, anything that is on your mind.
Let the members go first.
Please.
Yeah, this open source software you mentioned is to apply to voting machines, but people can still screw up their ballots if they vote by mail, and that's a lot of people. So worry about tabulation as well.
Well, the tabulation is when we talk about the machines, we talk about the entire system, so front to end. So from the ballot printers to the tabulation, all open source. But you're right, when we talk about mail-in ballots, even though there is a convenience piece to it that certain parties, maybe ours, might enjoy, because the more the merrier, getting the vote out is crucial. But you are correct in that it raises a security issue, and dealing with that security piece has been accomplished by the open source community for paper ballots. So there is Dr. Gilbert, who I mentioned to you, did address this and has a solution for transmission of the ballot. But there's a lot of interest here. Again, the disability community with the paper ballot and voting at home, they have an interest. The security community has something to say. And then, of course, the parties have their thoughts, because they do want to make sure we can get out the vote. So somewhere there is a sweet spot, but there is almost a push and pull between the convenience of the mail-in voting and the security of any time you hand a ballot to a postman and it's driving around in circles. Or in Los Angeles, sometimes they throw them into helicopters and fly them around election night, whatever's happening. You know, it's not ideal, but however a jurisdiction decides they want to do it, at least the open source software piece comes into play, because it's a separate issue, basically. But you're right, and in a perfect world, we might give more thought to shoring up that but I know we do enjoy the ease of it. Please. Somebody have a question?
I have a couple of them. Let me ask one and then
Okay,
go to
okay.
somebody else. For those of us who can barely spell computer, when I first heard the term open source many years ago, I really didn't have any idea what does that mean, open source, and who has access to it, who can, most importantly, who can and can't have authority to make changes in it, and that it's more secure. Why is it more secure? I'm sure you're right.
Well, again, keeping it to lay speak as a lay person, and if I had, you know, the brain of Brian Fox, or who we rely upon in some of these matters, or some of these techies that really know about this stuff, to keep it in lay speak, the more amount of eyes on the code is crucial for spotting bugs. And the fact that we call it open source is a bit of a misnomer, to the extent that it's not open to manipulation by folks who get their hands on it. They have their own version, but that version doesn't affect or infect the main body of work. That's done with permission for addition, is my understanding, I guess. And I'm making the terms up, I'm sure, being less than eloquent in the space, but the idea is, as I mentioned previous today, that the fact that it's open to the public doesn't enable the bad guys to get a head start. What it really does is enable the good guys to keep up with the bad guys. I think in this space, you assume often that you're going to encase. Well, first of all, you do encase and lock down the code, but you assume the hacker is going to hack and that they're going to get in to your system. The question then becomes, how do you address that once they're in? In an open source environment, there's a shift of the dynamics that may actually keep the bad guys out, but let's just say they get in anyway. At that point, you have an ability to recognize the problem and to address it. With the current systems, which we call black box, once they're in there, they're going to live in there, and you have to accept that. And so that's problematic unto itself. We want a glass box, something that many eyes, interested parties can look at, and they will with elections. There's been some conversation, naysayers saying, well, let's say you do what you want, and we don't agree with the Department of Defense or NASA. We don't think people are going to look at it if you let them, so the whole thing implodes on itself. Well, we think there's enough interest in elections that people will come to the party and be taking a look at that code, especially, let it be known that with an open source environment, there's been great work by folks such as Kai-Ping Yi and working with Alan Decker, where they reduce the amount of lines of the code. So you have a more elegant setting, and for proofreading, for lack of a better term, using a layperson term, you're now just going through less lines of code. So that's important. If you have to look at an overly voluminous amount of code, it may be a more difficult proofread than having a more concise amount. So that's something to be noted. There's many advantages, again, and I'm sure I'm leaving a lot out. Okay. Please, Bill.
They take over election officer positions. Have you heard much about open source or software and voting machines in that context? In which way has it been covered in terms of whether the people who are looking to undermine or get more control on the right over voting, prefer it or have identified it as a boogeyman, or are they just not talking about it?
I think 2020 had an unusual effect where all of a sudden the Republicans, well, obviously you saw Trump went ballistic, but he never really got his arms around this piece of it. So, but I wouldn't want to bet on that continuing. Because there are groups now, Look Forward America. They're I think Trump supporters. And they're honoring Republicans. When I was speaking to the Democratic Judiciary Committee, they said, I think flippantly to me, hey Turner, go get some Republicans and see what effect that has, because if you bring them back to the table, I think you're gonna do better. So I think by luck, talking to Brainerd from Look Forward America, and he's not necessarily pleasant to speak with, but he did serve purpose in that the Republicans are now interested in this. And so there is bipartisanship, uniquely enough on this issue. I think both sides can agree from a patriotic perspective, we want a clean vote count. We want the will of the people respected. So maybe not all Republicans think that way. Maybe not all Democrats think that way, but I think the grand majority want a clean vote count. So yes, they're aware of this, and I think you're probably going to see it. That being said, the corporations still have hooks in the Republicans, just like, unfortunately, I think they do in all parties. Maybe not the Green, I don't know, but maybe not the Green so much, but probably, I don't know. But anyway, that's what I'm seeing is there is bipartisanship here on this one issue. And so they like open source. At least this group was advocating for it. And they even had me on a talk show where I was speaking to all Republicans, and that was a first. And they didn't, throw rocks at me. I was, online, but I mean, they sort of accepted the information and thought, well, that's interesting. So we could upgrade the software and have a better system. And I think that's the takeaway. Any other questions? One more? Please.
And to Herb's point about the mail-in ballots, the tabulating machines would also have open source software running them. So
well, that's the first place.
Yeah. So the voters might miss mark. That's a bit of a problem.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. mail, I think that's pretty secure, all things considered. But once it gets to the central tabulating, it's going to be open source software that's running all those tabulation machines. So for the same reasons that it makes the whole system secure, it would make that one more secure. My question is about Voting Works, which is this nonprofit company that has developed an open source software system and is now offering to do free pilot programs with various counties like San Francisco. How do they make their money? I mean, if it's, tell me more about the open source general public license or whatever you call it. And it's great that they're doing this, but they got to make some money somewhere. How do
I think they're going to fall into a model, and they may be 50% of the price, but they're going to fall into a vendor model basically of service, which is the norm in the open source community. So you're not profiting off the licensing scheme because that's a freebie, but you are providing service like Red Hat. There's a company, Red Hat, in the open source community that, they've made billions. And so it's a service model. And by the way, these other companies, the other vendors that are in the space now, they could come along and do the right thing, but they're not going to, but they could. And, they could. But it becomes a service model. So they're going to, they could just change their columns around in their cost sheet and not charge for this, but now charge for that. And still they could try and price gouge. But Voting Works, I think, is just going to be a regular vendor. And hopefully we have more like them. Right now, we're deficient because we only have one. We need 4. Again, so there can be that sort of a robust marketplace for this. But thankfully, at least we have one, because this has been pioneering work that, you know, people would just rather preserve the status quo. It's less work basically for everybody, the election officials as well. But you do see some real stand-up folks, Bill Gardner in New Hampshire, whoever is doing Mississippi, and then there's some other places that are sprouting right now that, and hopefully California can get this together. Maybe one of these smaller counties will pop up with a pilot, because they're the ones that are really strapped for cash, and you know, this could benefit. Please.
I just wanted to point out that SAP, which I worked for a company that got their SAP financial software from them. We paid a lot more in consulting than we did for the actual software. Consulting was just millions, but the software, they were almost giving it away.
Right. Well, so that is the open source and the open source model, and we've just, it's been a long road. Well, it's been 20 years that I've been involved, since 2000, of trying to push the concept. Now, I think because, well, I think when we saw people with grappling hooks on the Capitol building, that was an eye opener for many folks when it comes to the need for bolstering voter confidence, because that's really the name of the game, is making sure the loser accepts the loss, and we're not having this internal conflict. By the way, which I think I'm aligned with Jim Woolsey on this. I think Putin thinks that's humorous, you know, that we are at such odds with each other. So this solution is coming. I hope that this information has been digestible. I know it's a lot there, but I mentioned the Real Activist movie, and my number is available through the club. If anybody ever wants to call me or contact me to have further conversation, I'm always available on this. And I thank you for your time and having me here today. Thank you.
Brent, we do have actually no question on the chat, but I wanted to call out Steve Preminger, our illustrious former party chair. He just said no question, but he finds it amusing to hear that to some, Brent is a moderate on election reform. But he's,
you know, I've been more of a fireball activist in my day when that was appropriate to be. But as you get older, of course, you don't want to spend your final days yelling at people nonstop. So I try to put it in a little friendlier terms. But we've also turned some corners where I think previous some people deserve to be confronted bluntly. Now, as we turn the corner and we have Secretary of State Weber, who comes from a family of slaves, I think is her background. She is like she is the perfect person to lead on this. So we're really seeing California poised to lead on this. And that's the hope, is that we expedite. And again, I thank you all.
Steve wanted to thank you for the presentation. And great to hear the support for our registrar, because she has been pretty embattled. I know.
Great, but let's push her. Let's not let anything, I don't want to go soft. And now that Steve brought it up, let's give it a push. Thank you all again. Thank you.